Constance Marten and the Predator's Grip, Part 3. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You understand the circumstances of the criminal activity of Constance Marten and her partner, Mark Gordon. I explained to you the background, the upbringing of Constance Marten, which was one of privilege, and overall an individual who was regularly described as a kind and happy-go-lucky person who appeared to have suffered considerably as a consequence of her involvement with a cult leader in Africa. She has, of course, been convicted of a very serious crime involving the death of a baby. But questions remain as to how she would allow that to happen. Where was her emotional empathy? And how did she come to be involved with Mark Gordon? For as you are about to hear, he is the polar opposite of her. Born in London in 1974 to a single mother from Jamaica, Gordon grew up in inner-city Birmingham, where his childhood was fractured and full of disruption, which would suggest repeated lack of control environments. The youngest of 5 children, he never knew his father, who refused to meet him or support him financially. Again, difficulties in relation to the issue of control. He had a traumatic start to life, including in his formative years. In August 1986, when he was 12 years old, his mother, Sylvia Satchell, a registered nurse, decided to take Gordon and his older sister Karen to live in the United States. They initially settled in New York, moving into an apartment in the Bronx. Gordon was enrolled at the local middle school, where he was a grade A student and expressed an ambition to become a doctor. In the summer of 1988, Sylvia Satchell took her youngest son to visit her cousin in Florida. He was so enchanted by seeing orange trees for the first time, he begged his mother to move the family to the Sunshine State. Concerned by the crime rate in New York, she agreed, and in early 1989 they relocated, renting a house on a quiet, palm tree-lined street in the Broward County area of Miami. Gordon, who was still fixed on becoming a doctor, was enrolled in the local Hallandale High School, but he struggled to make friends and began skipping class. According to his mother, he spent most of his time by himself in his bedroom, and it was around this time he developed an obsession with pornography, reading magazines, and watching the Playboy channel. Then, in April 1989, just 2 months after moving to the area, and when he was still just 14 years old, Gordon committed an unspeakable crime. Armed with hedge clippers and a knife, he broke into his neighbour's house and subjected her to a 4.5-hour rape ordeal. This clearly exhibits an absence of emotional empathy through the commission of this criminal act of a serious nature. In the weeks leading up to the attack, he had used a ladder to spy on the victim, lack of boundary recognition, whose home was yards from his own backyard. At around 5:30 a.m. on April the 29th, dressed in dark clothing and with a pair of tights covering his face, Gordon climbed in through her bathroom window. Alerted by the family dog, the victim, a single mother, went into the living room to be confronted by the armed attacker. She began screaming, but Gordon threatened to kill her young children, use of threat, absence of emotional empathy, who were sleeping in the next room. After ordering her to go back into her bedroom, he subjected her to hours of rape and sexual abuse, threatening to slit her throat. Sexual assault, threat, absence of emotional empathy. The victim, who is now 65, said, "He was so strange, so odd, that he couldn't have been normal. The fact that he didn't talk, other than to order me around, he was almost not human. He was just an evil being." At around 8 a.m., her 7-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son began knocking on her bedroom door, asking why she wasn't up. Fearing what Gordon might do to them, she tried to keep them calm, saying she had a headache and would be up soon. Eventually, she persuaded Gordon to let her go, and he fled. But 3 weeks later, on May the 21st, he struck again, breaking into another house. After luring the family dog out of the house, he removed a window before climbing inside. This time, he was armed with a spade, and he also strategically placed kitchen knives around the house. Creeping past the sleeping 1-year-old, he made his way into the master bedroom. But his intended victim was not alone, and her husband, Patrick Nash, leapt out of bed and confronted him. Gordon, then 2 weeks shy of his 15th birthday, used the spade to batter Nash, physical assault, absence of emotional empathy. Yet, even with blood pouring from a gaping wound on his head, Nash was able to chase Gordon out. Speaking from his home in Florida, he said, "Everything was so fast. I just saw a figure and then I was bleeding. I wasn't supposed to be there that morning. I was supposed to go to a flea market with my dad, but we decided not to go. Thank goodness I was home." 3 days later, Florida detective Gary Saletti knocked on Gordon's door after neighbors reported him acting suspiciously. The police officer described how the teenager was standing with his older brother looking very nervous. "I said, Mark, if you did something, you have to deal with it. If you didn't, but you've got the rest of your life. You are just a kid." I didn't pressure him at all. I didn't say a word after that. I just went about my business looking around, and he looked at me and he said, "I did it. I went into her house." During his initial police interview, Gordon had claimed someone called Jerome had forced him at gunpoint to commit the crimes. Nullification of threat to control. But he later relented and confessed. He was charged with multiple counts of armed sexual battery, armed kidnapping, armed burglary, and aggravated battery. And because of the serious nature of the offences, he was dealt with in the adult rather than the juvenile court. In a statement to the court, his first victim described him as cruel and devious, and described how at one stage he told her to say goodbye to her children, telling her, "This is the day you are going to die." She pleaded with the judge. "Someone who is capable of doing this, a cruel, calculated act at this young age, is not going to get better. He's only going to do more harm to society. Please protect the innocents by keeping the guilty in prison for his life. Show him no mercy." In March 1990, he was found guilty of 4 charges of sexual battery. David Hodge, who prosecuted the case for the state, says, "I was just so offended by the brutality that this guy showed." During the sentencing hearing, Gordon's mother pleaded with the judge to show her son leniency, outlining his difficult upbringing and lack of a father figure. "I just don't know where Mark went wrong," she said. "I don't know why things went the way they did. I worked very hard as a nurse and I've tried to raise these kids to the best of my ability on my own." She continued, "The victims, I know they must have gone through hell if he did what he did. I'm speaking on behalf of him. I think he's truly sorry for what he did." But her pleas for leniency fell on deaf ears. He was handed a life sentence. Despite Gordon's admission and subsequent conviction, some of his family members remain sceptical of his guilt. His older half-sister, Karen Satchel, age 54, has suggested she thinks Gordon was fitted up by the police in Florida. In January last year, she posted a picture on social media showing her younger brother when he was aged around 13, shortly before he was convicted for rape. Alongside it, she wrote, "This is Mark Gordon at age 13, but couldn't be much different at age 14. Not much of a monstrous rapist wielding a shovel, so stop lying about my bruv." In July last year, a few days after Gordon and Marten were charged with child cruelty and causing or allowing the death of a child, she wrote online, "My mind is heavy at this time with the burdens and injustices of life." On the 23rd of March, several weeks into the Old Bailey proceedings, she posted a collage of photographs of mothers cradling their babies and wrote a heartfelt plea on the couple's behalf. Guilty or not guilty of bonding with your newborn as she sleeps on your chest only to wake up and find your angel has passed away, and now you must face the trauma of being sent to prison for manslaughter. What more can they expect to do? Free Gordon and Marten. Gordon later successfully appealed to have his original plea withdrawn on the basis that he'd received poor legal advice, also arguing that his sentence had been miscalculated. But before the case could go to trial, Gordon's defence team persuaded him there was no chance of an acquittal, and he again pleaded guilty. This time, he was handed a 40-year prison sentence, of which he would serve half. During his 20 years behind bars, Gordon was incarcerated at 18 different prisons across the state of Florida, including the notorious Dade Correctional Institution and Santa Rosa Correctional Institution. In January 2010, aged 35, Gordon was released on parole and deported to the United Kingdom, where he was forced to sign the sex offenders register and keep the police informed of his movements. Settling in East London, he began working as a labourer in the construction industry. Then in 2016, a chance encounter in a London shop brought him and Marten together. We went for a coffee, and it went from there. He's my soulmate, she later explained. Friends said it was as if Marten had suddenly discovered something she had been looking for her whole life. Thoughts of a career in journalism or the arts were extinguished. Mark Gordon was her future now. The couple quickly moved in together, red flag, taking advantage of Marten's access to the Sturt Family Trust Fund, residual benefit, which paid her a monthly stipend but also allowed her to apply for advances or one-off payments. She introduced Gordon to members of her family, but they did not warm to him, and it appears that she took offence. In 2017, the couple went to Peru, where they attended a retreat. While in South America, the couple took part in a local marriage ceremony, though it is not regarded as legal in Britain. On their return home, Marten sent a message to her family and friends telling them she was effectively cutting off contact with them. A source close to the family explained, out of the blue she sent a text saying she'd chosen to live her life in a different way. She told us this was her decision and hers alone, freely made, and she did not want any of us to try to contact her again, not to try to meet up with her, and she wanted everyone to respect that, for better or worse. It may appear to those on the outside that her family cut her off when she got together with Mark, but it was the other way around. It was Marten saying she didn't want anything to do with them. Accordingly, hitherto, she had had a decent relationship with her family, but the moment that she's involved with Mark Gordon, she is persuaded by him to have nothing more to do with her family, which, as you all know, is a classic manoeuvre of the predator and abuser to ensure that that individual is isolated from support networks, making the monopolization of their time far easier and the control of that individual much easier also. The extent of the self-imposed isolation was painfully illustrated in 2021, when Marten's brother Max married jewellery designer Ruth Amer, who had been one of her best friends. The lavish ceremony was attended by hundreds of guests and was featured in Vogue, but Marten was not there. Again, the power of control over her resulted in her missing her brother's wedding. In 2017, members of the family who had not known the full details of Gordon's criminal past applied to the US authorities for court papers, hoping to find out more. But by the time they discovered the full horror of his convictions, Marten was pregnant with their first child. Swift pregnancy, another method of asserting control over a victim, and, of course, not only is it the case of getting that individual pregnant as a means of gaining control, but also doing so very early in the relationship. The couple, who were living in a camper van at the time, had not registered the pregnancy with a doctor, and it was only when Marten went to hospital for another matter that medics expressed concern that she had not received any antenatal care. But Marten and Gordon disappeared, prompting the medics to put out a national hospitals alert, fearing she might be in danger. The pair had aspirations of living off-grid, but as a convicted rapist, Gordon was required to inform the police of his whereabouts. They had also managed to accumulate £6,000 worth of driving offences and parking fines, lack of accountability, and were being aggressively pursued by bailiffs, requiring her family to instruct a solicitor on their behalf. Her father hired private investigators to track them down, and the fines were eventually settled by the trust fund. Freeloading. In November 2017, Marten turned up unannounced at a hospital in Wales in the early stages of labour. Speaking in a fake Irish accent and giving the name Isabella O'Brien, she claimed to be a runaway from a traveller family in Leeds, adding that she had been born and raised in a caravan, had never attended school, and was not registered with a GP. Lies. She introduced Gordon as a friend, but insisted he was not the father of the story. Their cover story was blown, however, when social workers linked them to the National Hospitals Alert. A row ensued on the maternity ward and staff became so concerned that they called the police. Gordon, who had failed to inform police of his whereabouts as required, lack of accountability, continued to insist his name was James Amer, lie, but he blew his cover when he told police his date of birth was April 31st. Not a particularly bright man then, even though he had aspirations of being a doctor. As the situation escalated, Gordon became violent and attacked 2 female police officers, absence of emotional empathy. He was arrested and on November the 14th, 2017, appeared at Llanelli Magistrates Court, where he pleaded guilty to 2 charges of assaulting a police officer and failing to comply with the requirements of the Sex Offenders Register. He was jailed for 20 weeks and fined £415. Soon after, social services got involved and discovered that despite it being winter, Marten was living in a tent in the woods with little, if any, provisions for a newborn baby. One social worker was shocked to find the festival-style tent was collapsing under the weight of rainwater and full of bags of rubbish and bottles of urine. Deeply concerned about the child's welfare, social workers successfully applied for a supervision order. Social workers also expressed concern about the fact that Marten would fall asleep with her baby, and she was warned about the dangers of accidental suffocation. Perhaps because Gordon had spent most of his adult life in prison, and Marten had been brought up in such privileged surroundings, neither appeared to have a clue how to care for a newborn baby. In the spring of 2019, Marten gave birth to their second child in secret, failing to seek medical support nor register the birth as required by law, lack of accountability. With 2 children to look after, the couple abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and moved to London, choosing to rent a series of run-down properties rather than accept an offer from the trust fund to buy them a house. Nullification of potential threat to control as a consequence of that offer. One family source said the trustees tried to help her as much as they could, but she was a nightmare for them to deal with. Difficult, contrary, unpredictable, and entitled. The source claims that certain emails purporting to be from Marten requesting money were in fact written by Gordon. Freeloading. Within weeks of giving birth to their second child, Marten was expecting again, but in November 2019, when she was around 4 months pregnant, she suffered serious injuries after falling from a first-floor window. When paramedics arrived at the house, Gordon initially refused to let them in. Paranoia, lack of emotional empathy. But when Marten was admitted to hospital, it was discovered she had shattered her spleen. The unborn baby was unharmed, but she was kept in hospital for 8 days. The police were informed as it was suspected she had been pushed, but when asked what had happened, Marten insisted she had fallen while trying to adjust a television aerial. She refused to give a statement to police, however, and attempted to discharge herself from hospital, ignoring warnings from the doctors about the risks of doing so to herself and to her baby. Lack of emotional empathy, lack of accountability. A judge sitting in the family court later concluded that Marten had been a victim of domestic violence. Marten's eldest brother Max was informed of the incident and he contacted their father, who was in Australia at the time. Napier became so concerned about the welfare of the children that he decided to intervene and applied to the courts for temporary wardship of them. Napier also offered to buy a house in Dorset and employ a nanny to look after the children until his daughter was able to join them. But when she got wind of the application, Marten fled to Ireland. Paranoid about her family tracking her down, she used cash to rent a rural cottage near Dublin. The plan was for Gordon to join her later, but the court seized his passport, meaning he was unable to travel. Reluctantly, Marten returned to Britain to reunite with him and in May 2020 gave birth to her third child. The family began moving regularly from one run-down rented property to another, a far cry from the palatial surroundings of Critchell House, which by now had been sold by the Marten family to a US hedge fund billionaire for £34 million. In May 2021, almost a year to the day after giving birth to their third child, Marten had a fourth baby. But by now social services had decided to intervene, and in January 2022, a judge ordered that all 4 children be taken into care and put up for adoption. Within weeks of that order being made, Marten was pregnant again, lack of accountability, with baby Victoria. This time, she and Gordon were determined they would keep her at all costs, sense of entitlement. In the weeks leading up to the birth, they moved off-grid, travelling the country in a series of clapped-out cars, sleeping in cheap bed and breakfasts and holiday lets. Marten gave birth to Victoria in an Airbnb cottage in a remote part of Northumberland on Christmas Eve 2022. But appallingly, within weeks, the baby was dead. After 54 days on the run, the couple were arrested. They were both subsequently charged with manslaughter, child cruelty, concealing the birth of a child, allowing the death of a child, and perverting the course of justice by concealing a body. They spent a year on remand, Marten at HMP Bronzefield in Surrey, where killer nurse Lucy Letby was held, and Gordon at the maximum security HMP Belmarsh in South East London, before their first trial began at the Old Bailey in January 2024. Giving evidence, Marten repeatedly broke down as she spoke about losing her daughter and the void that had been left when her other children were taken into care. Under cross-examination, she sought to blame her powerful, well-connected family and social services for her situation, telling the court her children had been stolen by the state. She even likened her case to that of the Post Office Horizon scandal and said she believed one day she and Gordon would receive a public apology for the way they had been treated. Delusion. The case had been scheduled to last for 8 weeks, but due to a string of frustrating delays, often the result of Marten and Gordon's attempts to derail the proceedings, it ended up taking 6 months. Even then, the jury was unable to reach a verdict on the substantial charges, and the couple were remanded back into custody ahead of a retrial, which began in March of this year. Despite repeated attempts by the couple to again sabotage the trial, they were both eventually found guilty of gross negligence manslaughter and now face prison for at least 2/3 of their 14-year sentences. For Marten, despite everything, her family has let it be known that they are still there for her. One source close to her father said life will be very difficult for Constance. Napier would prefer she goes to a secure mental establishment to get the psychiatric help she so obviously needs, but he will be there for her if she wants him to be. His door will always be open. The background of Constance Marten, a clearly troubled individual and a serial offender, a convicted criminal, Mark Gordon. The impression that's given is that Marten was very much in the grip of a predator, that he controlled her, that he was the one that made this decision that they would live off-grid, and that she fell under his spell, agreeing with all of that, having similar views to his, governed by paranoia in relation to a distrust of the authorities, hence the lack of antenatal care. How much of that was her own views and how much of it was influenced by Gordon, well, that's something that will be established. But in the next and final part, we're going to assess what are these two individuals and what was the dynamic between the two of them that led to the tragic outcome involving the death of a child through neglect. Join me in part 4.